So our next speaker is Jamie Richardson. Okay, I can see he can share the screen. So Jamie Richardson is a shelter and settlement technical advisor at Catholic Relief Services and CEO of Shelter and Construction Consultant. He has worked on shelter and infrastructure programs over 20 years for the Red Cross and other NGOs. He contributed to the Malawi Safer House construction guidelines following the 2009 Karonga earthquake. He has been on the advisory board for the Prepare project. And Jamie, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can I just confirm you can see my screen okay?
Yes, we can, and it's in presentation mode. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yes, and thank you for the introduction. So I won't go over that again, but just to say that I am working with Catholic Relief Services at the moment, and have just returned from Malawi as part of the flood response, but also because we're spending some time there working on various programs, longer-term programs, looking at housing resilience, especially for low-income households within Malawi. And as you can see there on the statistics that we have, and I think this lines very much with the last presenter, Francis, where you were kind of highlighting the fact that these floods and these disasters are really impacting the poorest, because it obviously they're caught in a cycle of crises where their livelihoods, their incomes, the amount that they're spending on the housing is being repeatedly impacted upon. So when we actually look at some of the, especially around flooding, we can see a few images here of the type of impact it has here, with burnt brick houses with mud mortar and corrugated roofed houses. And in fact, this is much more of a kind of middle income house than somebody from a low income house. And just a few crumpled bits of roof sheeting may seem not so significant to us, but for a family in Malawi on a low income, this can be something that is unobtainable for the very low income families who could never afford to have roof sheeting, and for others that may take months and months or years to even kind of get the money to be together to build a house. So losing your home can be absolutely devastating, on top of losing your crops for this year, losing your livelihood, and being displaced, and all the other impacts that are affected by it. So we're very much focused on the impact it has upon the household, and looking at the diversity within that household. We have the livelihoods, we have the men, the women, the children, it's the education, all the other concerns that a household has. Actually, the housing aspect may not be their highest priority. In fact, when you talk to households, often their highest priority is around work, about nutrition, around education, and housing may actually come quite low down the list. So when we're talking about having more resilient housing, this may not be their highest priority, and we have to remember that as we're working with and discussing these things with communities. So when we look at, I'm going to focus on self-recovery after disaster. When we, there's no particularly hard and fast statistics around this, but I can say from kind of experience kind of globally, is that we could only expect a small percentage, maybe 10% of the population ever getting any realistic support in recovery. Everybody else, the other kind of 90, 70, 80, 90% are going to be rebuilding for themselves, and often rebuilding without any additional knowledge to be able to do in a more resilient way. And that was something that has become more interesting to us as we're thinking about how we can be more impactful in our programming. So a little bit on CRS, we're working in a number of different countries around the world. The way that we like to work is to work very closely with our partners within country and the communities that we're supporting. And we're trying to look for the most sustainable, locally appropriate techniques and methods to be able to build back for those communities, either by providing them a home to go back to, or to be able to provide something transitional that they can live in or adapt and change over time, so that they can get towards a permanent house over time. And so you can see a few examples here from housing within from Gaza, from Bosnia, through to different programs with Africa, Madagascar, and so on. We come from a sector, or belong a sector that's referred to as the shelter and settlement sector. It's the cluster that is part of the UN humanitarian response mechanism. And within that shelter and settlement sector, it has been largely dominated by engineers and architects who have taken on very much looked at the physical living space that people have. And we've talked about having, strong and durable and safe shelters. But we're moving away from that and seeing that actually, because of what I was just saying about shelter being just not the highest priority to households, that they have to consider recovery in a multifaceted way, is that we're taking on a much more of a sustainability view of this, and we have a particular framework that we use for that, which we call the Integral Human Development Framework, which is basically a sustainability model. And we can see in there all the different aspects that we would need to consider when we're looking at recovery and working with communities and households for them to be able to achieve that. So going back to that percentage, that's 90% of people who don't get any support after disaster for their recovery. We were thinking about how we do, or how we might influence that group or support that group. In 2015, from 2013 on to 2015, we conducted a study looking at 5 different countries, going back to places where we had supported communities to see if the DRR features that we were encouraging on those houses to be more resilient were being adopted by people who were not directly supported by the program. So we were looking for instances of replication, but also seeing why people didn't replicate. And through those interviews with key stakeholders and households, etc., we were getting a bit of a picture about what were the determinants in terms of being able to encourage people to adopt disaster risk reduction features in the houses, even if they were not being directly supported. And that was going to help us to think about and inform our programming going forward. So in the same year this was published, in 2015, there was some floods in southern Malawi, and we decided to implement our program based upon those recommendations. Part of those recommendations were to work very closely with communities, very kind of grassroots participatory approaches, to make sure that the techniques that we were looking at were going to be locally appropriate and achievable by those communities, which meant looking at low-cost solutions, but also building upon the indigenous knowledge and techniques that already exist. So kind of recognizing the strengths that the community already had and building upon those at the same time. We did this through a series of workshops with communities, with local artisans, and working with them, we developed a curriculum that became their curriculum that was then rolled out across a number of different communities in the Zomba-Flombe area. Going back there in 2020, we found that we were doing some more programming in that area, and we noticed that a lot of the houses that were replicating some of the design features that we were promoting. Mainly that there was roof features that protected the walls, raised plinths, and a few other features. And here's an example of this. And the level of replication was really high. I mean, it was very noticeable, it was anecdotal. So we went back and actually conducted a study on that, taking a sample area, and we found, and also then to delve into that to see, why it was that people replicated and who were the agents that provided that information. And it was very clear at that point that actually local artisans were very instrumental in promoting the safer building practices that were being adopted. So based upon that information, this encouraged us to have to further research through the Global Child's Research Fund with partners from Oxford Brookes University and cluster partners within Malawi, which included CARE and CARE, Habitat for Humanity, Caritas, CRS, the Ministry of Lands, Housing and Urban Development, and others. And over a period of around 18 months, we tested a set of protocols which have been designed by the Global Shelter Cluster for doing this kind of local investigation. So there's a set of 9 steps that helps practitioners to be able to investigate local building technologies. And at the same time, we recorded the vernacular within Malawi, so that this can be a resource for in the future when actors are involved in response or development, to be able to have an insight into the construction practices within Malawi. So these, building upon that, we are looking to reinforce and build upon the Safer House Construction Guidelines, which Francis mentioned earlier, which were developed by initially by the Malawi Red Cross after the earthquake in Karonga, and then were revised again. And recently, speaking with the Ministry of Lands and Housing and Urban Development, the thought that these may want to be revised again because there are some changes that we can see coming in, especially where we're seeing the greening of the housing sector. So that moving away, for example, from using burnt bricks, which are having such damage to the natural environment. One thing that a new dimension, or a dimension that we are becoming, increasingly conscious of, and I think this speaks to, a number of the other speakers today, when we're looking at kind of multi-hazard and the impact around them. When we look at the deaths each year from earthquakes, storms, and floods, and this is an average over a few years, we can see, the impacts of that. And obviously, earthquakes vary greatly. I mean, we can have these kind of huge tsunami events, through to the kind of annual storms, floods, and the impacts around climate change we're seeing there. And so it's quite significant. But when we put that up against some other issues that are connected with housing, such as waterborne disease, respiratory disease, malaria, TB, etc., and others, we can see that actually kind of some of these health issues are far more significant than and constant than the return events that we may see on some of these other disaster events. So our focus, going back to where we came from in shelter and settlements, which was very much around the structure of the building, the safety and the durability of that, we were missing a trick, if you like, by not recognizing that the living conditions that created and how that is significant to kind of health outcomes. So we are really focusing and putting some parity of steam, around around health as being a feature of housing as well. And to that end, we've been supporting a number of initiatives that have been focused on that, where shelter and health have been combined together, including not just around the physical health, but also about the psychological health and well-being as well. When we are looking at housing resilience, durability, etc., quite often we're finding that there are model houses that are coming out of this, and we're getting more resistant to that because we recognize that there is such a range of capacity, of contexts that people actually live in, which means that we have to have different houses for different areas, different range of values of those, the build costs in those areas to meet the purse of those people that are there. And we can see that, for example, we've just carried out a study in the area where the floods have just happened. And you can see that some households almost have nothing that they can contribute to the house other than the purchase of very small items that are going to contribute to it. The rest of it is by using materials that are available to them for free. So if we are going to provide some sort of support to these households, these very poor income households, we have to find solutions that can help them. And maybe that we can find the mechanisms by which they can afford those little bits of uplift that can increase the durability around it. So what we want to make sure is that we actually have a differentiated approach that meets the range of households that we're working with, but also to have strategies around that. For example, people who have who can save up or have access to loans are able to buy a house that's built for them. Other people are going to have to build their houses incrementally over a period of time. And in fact, most people in the world build their houses incrementally, so there's nothing unusual about that. One area that we are seeing how we can actually get to scale on this is, first of all, by looking at the housing market and then the supply and demand around that. And we're very conscious now to be able to say, in this ecosystem, what is it that we can influence to change the market, to make it possible? So it may be by providing access to materials that people didn't have before. Maybe it's about maybe it's something to do with land rights. It could be a number of different things that are those catalysts that change things. So this is one of the areas that we're really looking at in terms of the ways that we can support self-recovery. And finally, there is still space for the innovations, and we're looking at around the kind of different sort of materials that we can use in the innovations that we can see around that, and the opportunities that we can see within the environment we're working within. So if we're moving away from burnt brick, for example, how do we affordably find ways to stabilize earth bricks, and looking at the possibility of using waste materials within the area. And the other one is around the dissemination of those skills, and how do we do that in a way that is going to be sustainable within the construction skill market. And what is very complex and very difficult, especially in an area like a context like Malawi, is looking at housing finance. Access to loans, revolving funds, saving groups may provide those small amounts of money that can just give that little. So just kind of finally, when we're looking at housing self-recovery, to support that. One is in our approaches. I think one is that it has to be through kind of community-based approaches. And then we can see some particular aspects within that, where we can see around settlement planning is going to be a very important feature, especially with climate change, as well as the technical aspects, finance, and linking with livelihoods. Cross-cutting all of these, that we can see gender, disaster risk reduction, and environment being kind of themes that are going to cross-cut all our thinking around these areas. So this is, when we're talking about self-recovery now, we're thinking far more than just, it's more than the four walls on the roof. It is about looking at the whole ecosystem, and also the recovery priorities of the household, so that we can make those plans with communities and individual households to be able to achieve them within the time frame that's realistic for them. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jamie. This was very, very valuable. I can see two comments, actually one comment and one question in the chat. I will just read one question. For the comments, I will ask you to address in the chat, because we are a tad behind the schedule. There is a question from Innocent about the low-cost house model, and whether it was tested for resilience under various hazard exposures. This is the question.
Thank you very much. So we did actually, most of it was done, that it wasn't so much tested beforehand, the testers were going. We took best practices based upon the experiences within community of the most resilient building practices that were there. We then went back to those areas, and we literally just went back to them now. I went back to traveling a week and a half ago, back to Volombe, looking at the houses that we built to see how they had performed within the floods that had just happened. So we could see some of those features that were working well, and it also allowed us to kind of look at the features that we'd like to improve upon. And so it's an ongoing and iterative process. Thank you.